All right, we're going to get rolling here. This is a special 90-minute episode, if you will, of BDC Presents, talking about the future of gas. And it takes a lot of time to unpack that. So that's why we've reserved an hour and a half for our conversation here today. I'm Kristen George Bagdanoff, and I will be your host and your guide as we talk about the economic, equity related issues, regulatory landscape, everything under the sun about the future of gas. Before we jump into things, I want to tell you a little bit about BDC. The Building Decarbonization Coalition is a member-based organization that's working hard to decarbonize the built environment. And we do that through market transformation, policy, public engagement, every tool in the toolbox that can decarbonize buildings, we're looking to use it. So please join us. Membership is free. We go farther together. We also have an incredible monthly newsletter that is just jam-packed with policy information, events, reports from ourselves and others in the movement, and this cute little section called Panama's Porch. So if that sounds like something you want to dig into, please sign up for that. Now, membership is free, but we do have some overachieving members who financially support our work, and they make free public webinars like this one possible. So thank you so much to our Trailblazer members for that support. In addition to our BDC Presents call, we also have a couple policy calls. One is the national policy call, which rotates, focusing on the landscape of a couple different states. And I'm excited that this October we will be focusing on New York. So please register with that. And then we have a monthly policy call for California because there's just always so much drama in California. We have to talk about it every month. I have a feeling this next one is going to be celebratory because some of you may have heard Newsom just signed the neighborhood scale decarbonization bill, SB 1221. So I'm hoping that the October call will take some time to celebrate the good work many of you have done, as well as plan for the next session. And then finally, our next BDC Presents is in November. Hopefully this will be a celebratory atmosphere as well. But regardless of what happens, we are going to be planning for what's next. So please join us for that. All right, so as you can tell, you all are muted, and that's to make sure we can hear our panelists throughout. However, we will be collecting your questions throughout the webinar. So as they come to you, please enter them into the chat. We have folks working on the back end to gather them up, uplift, consolidate. And if we don't get to your question today, we will do our best to answer it offline. All of these wonderful notes, slides, recording, everything that you see here today will be sent to you early next week. So you already heard who I am. I manage the research at BDC. Let me introduce the rest of our wonderful panelists. We have Joe Dammel from RMI, and he is a manager on the carbon-free buildings team. And before he was at RMI, he was deep in the doggets in Minnesota, so much so that the AGA cited one of his comment letters in a report. So he's pretty much infamous for his legal and regulatory expertise. So I'm super excited for him to just lay out what's happening with our future of gas dockets. And then we have Dory Seavey, who is like my economic guru. I love the work that she and her team at Groundwork Data have done. I feel like they've really established a new framework for evaluating, modeling, and thinking about gas system investments. So super excited to have her here today. And then I'm very excited to have Professor Morgan Edwards from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She works in the Public Policy School and the Nelson Institute Center for Sustainability. And Morgan and I actually met at a climate conference in Berlin, and we just knew it was fate to work together. And she and her research team have done excellent work modeling energy burdens, how to avoid exacerbating existing inequalities in this clean energy transition, and she's going to be sharing that work with us today. So I'm going to kick things off with sort of a big picture roundup and synthesis about the future of gas. So what are we talking about when we talk about the future of gas? A working definition for the future of gas might be something like the set of questions, assumptions, and arguments that are associated with the long-term sustainability or lack thereof of the methane gas system. Over the past 5 years, this speculative and somewhat vague phrase has evolved from a niche research interest to a framework that's being applied not only to our regulatory proceedings, but to policies proposed by legislators, reports crafted by advocates, and campaigns launched by community activists. So this little timeline I put together to kind of represent some of the milestones that I think have cumulatively built the record and spurred actions that have gotten us to where we are today. So marking this momentum in 2019 isn't to negate all of the years and decades of work that activists and advocates had done before this point to think about the future of gas critically. But we mark 2019 as sort of this shift in the baseline where the phrase future of gas starts to crystallize into something that's more like a framework. So over the years, we've seen the opening of at my count, around 13 regulatory proceedings that we call future of gas proceedings starting in 2020. Joe's going to go into a ton of detail about these. But the first proceeding that I see call itself explicitly a future of gas proceeding is in Massachusetts, and they even locked down the futureofgas.com, lucky them. While other proceedings became dubbed future of gas proceedings by advocates who were noticing that a lot of these proceedings were dealing with the same things. They were looking at this disconnect between our climate targets and our gas planning. And so in calling them retrospectively future of gas proceedings, we helped create a narrative and a category that allowed us to ask certain questions. In the past 5 years, we've also been seeing a growing consensus around the gas system's uneven effects and how harmful that pollution is for historically disinvested communities. So one study in 2022 found that methane leaks are higher in communities with lower household incomes and with more people of color. At the same time, we've also seen moves toward the structural inclusion of equity targets for climate investments that might help remediate these harms. So the notable Federal Justice 40 initiative sets a standard for how you might rebalance benefits and risks of the energy system, and many of our states are using this as a guide. Along the way, in citing and responding to these proceedings and policies, we've seen over a dozen of what I'm calling future of gas reports. These are reports that are synthesizing utility data, modeling the risks of business as usual gas system growth, and developing nuanced solutions for addressing these issues in a timely and equitable manner. With all of this activity, it is perhaps no surprise that the future of gas is on the mind, sometimes daily, of policymakers across the US. This year, we saw 13 bills introduced in 11 states that we're calling future of gas bills. And we heard one state official say that she's asked about the future of gas every single day, which sounds exhausting, but also same. So this webinar has a thesis, and basically, I think that given all of this information, advocacy, and debate, there are certain arguments that perhaps controversial 5 years ago are now glaringly obvious. So we want to establish some of those fundamental truths here today with the goal of building consensus to accelerate the decarbonization movement. So let's chat a little bit about that consensus building before I get into those fundamental truths. So knowledge production and social movements work hand in hand. And one way to demonstrate this is something like this. So you have a critical mass of people, like a coalition, working together to establish evidence and experience-based arguments and actions that help demonstrate how the world is and how they think it should be. Over time, an archive solidifies and a constellation of concepts emerges, like the social cost of carbon or neighborhood scale decarbonization, and of course, the future of gas. This iterative process helps consolidate shared and historical knowledge to move the movement forward. And this consensus is what accelerates social movements at key junctures. I know that some of you are fans of Donna Meadows' systems theory, and so you know that the holy grail of leverage points is shifting ideologies or paradigms. However, this is also one of the most tricky shifts, and it's hard to know what exactly makes a whole mass of people think differently all of a sudden. While challenging, I think we can start or perhaps continue that paradigm shift together here today. So, if we think about this baseline in 2019, I think we could characterize it as the acknowledgement that there's a need to engage in long-term gas system planning because of climate targets. And so we have that acknowledgement lead to a series of reports, the proceedings here in gray over the years, getting us to, I think, a new baseline that we can shift forward. I think today, in addition to those environmental reasons, we can also confidently say that there are significant social, economic, and regulatory reasons why a managed transition off the gas system is necessary. And if you're squinting at all of these little boxes, don't worry. This is a hyperlinked bibliography that is coming to your inbox soon. So we have all of this evidence. I think we can shift the baseline. This baseline might not seem super controversial to some of us. However, think if every policy, every proceeding, every conversation about the gas system started not with the question of whether transition was needed, but with the affirmation that it was, and that in addition to these environmental reasons, we also have significant social, economic, and regulatory reasons. That's what I want for us to speak to today. So I'm going to end with nuancing this baseline a little bit with my 10, we'll call them 10 fundamental truths of what I think we know now about the gas system. The presenters here today will be expanding on some of these, and then BDC will also be following up with the requisite citations and arguments to help build out these claims. But for now, I'm just going to ask that you take my word for it, or at least feel free to ask questions in the chat about some of these claims. Here's what I think we know based on that archive of evidence and activity. I think we can all agree, probably most of us in our room, just that our climate targets are in conflict with gas system growth. I think probably a lot of us also understand that the polluting effects of the gas system are not evenly distributed. Some are much more at risk, some certainly benefit. This one is a little more theoretical, but basically when we think about the way our public utility commissions are structured today, they sort of crystallize around the assumption that gas and electricity were serving different end uses, and they weren't competitors, and therefore they were regulated as monopolies. However, we know today that electricity can serve basically every end use as gas. And so now we actually have this contradiction of competing monopolies, and I think we need to figure that out a bit more. Utilities are typically thought of as very stable investments, and for both investors and ratepayers, gas utilities are no longer a sound economic investment. Dory is going to go into more detail there, but the business model as it stands now is not going to hold up under this changing policy landscape. A lot of gas utilities are engaged in pipeline replacement programs that have overpromised and underdelivered. And we think these are sort of a band-aid for what we see as stagnating growth, and we need to address that. The same thing with climate change, where if we stop emitting today, we have kind of the ghost of the past affecting the future, occurs with our long-lived gas system assets. So because these pipelines live, for 60 years, decisions made decades ago will still have repercussions far into the future. And Dory Seavey calls this the undertow effect. This one is very important, and I think we will all agree about this as well, but vulnerable communities will be harmed if the transition off the gas system is not thoughtfully managed. So much depends upon that phrase, thoughtfully managed. Regulators, who are typically maybe backstage in our political drama, actually need to step into the spotlight to really make sure that our climate policy succeeds. So put on your dancing shoes, regulators. call me unreasonable, but I think that the data that we need to plan and manage the transition should be broadly accessible and not buried in fragmented filings or hidden under lock and key. And finally, cost recovery is at the heart of the relationship between ratepayers, utilities, and regulators. And some of our rate cases appear to function as if all costs are guaranteed to be recovered. And I think some commissions are reminding our utilities that while allowed, cost recovery is not guaranteed. And there are new standards that are going to be raising the yardstick of what is allowed and what is prudent. So with these warm to hot takes, I'm going to leave you in the expertise, in the good hands of our panelists. And Joe Damel is going to lead you through the exciting regulatory landscape of the future of gas. Take it away, Joe.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristen. And thank you everyone for joining this presentation. I want to thank Kristen for hosting and really guiding us through today, and BDC for the support as well. Next slide, please. My name is Joe Damel. I'm with RMI. This is a little bit more about RMI. I work on utility specific issues, especially gas utility issues. We've been involved in future of gas proceedings in Maryland, Illinois, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and several others. We've published work on utility regulatory reform, line extension allowances, NPAs, and we're currently doing some work on rate design and making sure that rate design for heat pumps is well thought out. As Kristen mentioned, I was most recently at Fresh Energy, which is a Minnesota-based nonprofit focused on energy policy issues. And I've also spent time at the Minnesota AG's office as a consumer advocate, state air agency as an attorney, and then started my career actually at a gas utility, CenterPoint. So have a perspective, I think, from a variety of different vantage points. Next slide, please. So we talk about the future of gas in future of gas proceedings. That is probably not a hot or even warm take, but that's where we're at. But some of you might be asking and joining today to try to understand what does that really even mean? Next slide. So today I'm going to provide this regulatory overview, and I'm going to attempt to answer all of these questions so that in 15 minutes you'll be able to walk away with an understanding of the landscape of gas, future of gas proceedings, what's driving them, what's being discussed, how do they actually unfold, what are opportunities to participate, what are other avenues for discussing these issues, what are some outcomes, what are challenges, and then how can you advance the conversation in your own state. Next slide, please. Okay, so most of the folks on the call, I'm sure, are very familiar with public utility commissions. Here is a list of a few that have opened or currently working on the future of gas issues. Why are future of gas proceedings happening at public utilities commissions? Will they regulate gas and electric utilities? In addition to historically and sometimes still telephone, water, railroads, warehouses, things like that. But we're today focusing on the regulation of gas utilities. And you can see here they go by different names, but they're all doing a very similar thing. There's a history of economic regulation. When we think of PUCs, we think of the rates that come out that we pay in our electric and gas and other bills monthly. They certainly set rates, but they do a lot more than that, as we're recognizing today, really aligning state energy and other important policy goals with that utility regulatory framework. So they've been hard at work for many decades trying to align these resources and policy goals. And this is just the latest example of commissions doing this. Next slide. So where are future of gas or gas transition proceedings happening? This is a list from about a year ago in our RMI publication. We can add Illinois to the list in the subsequent year or so. Um, and so you can see that population-wise, roughly a third of the US population lives in the state with the proceeding or proceedings that focus on the future of gas or the gas transition. You can see here the different colors indicate different flavors of proceeding, ranging from rulemakings to investigations to studies, and we'll get into some other varieties of these dockets in a minute here. Next slide, please. So each of these proceedings, you saw the docket numbers on the previous slide. I pulled a few of the proceeding titles in case folks aren't really familiar with Public Utilities Commission naming. They're not, they're very descriptive and not always the most pithy. But a few things to notice here are that, they're often titled investigations or examinations. That speaks to PUC's investigatory authority under their authority provided by their state statutes. And you can also notice here that they're often tied to long-term time horizons and greenhouse gas reductions. As Kristen mentioned, some of the drivers of these proceedings, they're in the name of the proceeding itself. So in bonus points, if you can name all of the states based on the title, I know I can. Well, I can because I pulled them out, but you can probably recognize some familiar ways that commissions name their dockets. That's a bonus points for the regulatory nerds. Next slide. Future of gas proceedings can originate via a number of different avenues. And I'll give a shout out to a blog post that Kristen has put together and updated over several years. Maybe we can put a link to it in the chat or the notes afterwards, but it gives a really good overview of everything I'm talking about today, and also this specific point of how do future of gas proceedings start. So it can be a commission on its own motion or on its own using its own investigatory authority, like we just mentioned. It could be legislation that requires a commission to open a proceeding. It can be a petition from a stakeholder. So we've seen in Massachusetts, the Attorney General's office filed a petition that kicked off their future of gas proceeding. In Maryland, the Office of People's Counsel filed a petition that initiated the proceeding there. So stakeholders can say, hey, this is a really important thing we need to address. And also executive orders. The governor's office establishing climate goals and wanting to align state agencies with those goals. So a variety of different ways they can open. But what happens once they're open? Next slide, please. Kristen did a really good job, and I know Morgan and Tori are going to do a good job as well, building on some of the drivers for future of gas proceedings. We talked a little bit already about climate and equity, but I think there's a couple other drivers that are at stake too. So affordability, and I think of affordability both in terms of the investments that Kristen mentioned that are happening to replace leaky or leak-prone pipe on the gas system that's having a real impact on rates, and also a more volatile gas pricing. So we saw the Winter Storm Uri in 2021. I think really was an example of how a really quick event can kind of really have a real and lasting bill impact on the prices that we pay for gas, and then all of the volatility that goes in with something that's a global commodity. So that's the overview of kind of where future of gas dockets are happening, why they've proliferated over the past half decade or so. The next part of my presentation is going to get into how proceedings like this typically unfold. Next slide, please. So what gets discussed? This is intended to be a little bit overwhelming because often they are overwhelming to participants and utilities and commissions. each one of these, as you kind of look through the list, each one of these can be a proceeding and sometimes are proceedings on their own. They can be highly technical and complex, and working through them can, require a lot of thought and a lot of effort. They're all really important. They're all really cross-cutting. An example of how a commission grapples with this came most recently in Illinois when a report from the facilitator of their future of gas proceeding laid out the list of issues that stakeholders had brought up in the initial phase of the docket. And it was over 15 pages of single-spaced lists and description of the issues. So really comprehensive, really, but also really overwhelming. So how do you deal with a list like this if you're a stakeholder, if you're an advocate, or if you're a commission? Next slide, please. One way is to look at different categories where those issues fit in. And these are really, really overlapping. And I think maybe managed transition is kind of the umbrella that it impacts all of these. But one way is to look at breaking up different topics by kind of these broader categories. There's another way too. Next slide, please. And that's really to look at near term, medium term, and long term. I'm going to give a hat tip to Advanced Energy United and Strategen. They recently released a report this spring that looks at kind of like near and medium and long term topics that we should be addressing. So what does this look like? So near term, we've seen things in dockets focusing on gas planning, on pipeline alternatives, line extension allowances. In the medium to long term, things like accelerated depreciation, stranded assets, different types of cost recovery, utility business model. And I'll just note that being in the medium or long term category doesn't mean that we don't need to talk about it today. I think a lot of the things are going to require a lot of thought and effort to make sure that we're set up for kind of the bigger picture policy changes that need to happen on the gas system while we're still making progress on near-term issues where the record and examples from other states are more developed and we can take action sooner. Next slide, please. So what happens in a future of gas proceeding? This is kind of the menu of options that commissions have typically chosen from to help a proceeding go from initiation to its endpoint, or at least one phase endpoint. So that's the menu of options. I'm going to do a little deeper dive into what one state, next slide, please, into what one state has done. So this is the Massachusetts 2080 docket. One of the first dockets that opened in 2020. You can see here the important milestones are indicated on the timeline. There's a stakeholder process that led to a pathway study and LDC filings that led to a comment period you see in 2022. And then the docket was quiet for over a year. And not all of a sudden, but in 2023, in December of 2023, the commission produced an order that we think is really far-reaching and sets the stage for a lot of policy change. So that's progress can be bumpy, even in states that we now see as really advancing the conversation. Commissions can get stuck, and there's ways to help get them unstuck. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. These are kind of outcomes of future of gas proceedings. So you can get orders like you'd have in 2080. You can have calls for legislation or legislation that happens in parallel with future of gas proceedings. You can see rulemaking or new proceedings. So for things like non-pipeline alternatives, line extension allowances, commissions have opened up new proceedings to modify or create new policy. Next slide. So these are some symptoms of maybe a good or positive proceeding and a proceeding that might be a little bit stuck. And again, it's not a binary. There are states that have maybe good objectives, but the process gets bogged down. But if you're in the state with a future of gas docket, you can maybe kind of look to this to see what how your state is doing. Now, how to get unstuck. Uh, the RMI has put out work maybe in 2022 on PUC modernization. I can put a link in the chat after this that looks at how to really realign public utility commissions with these state goals and decarbonization efforts. There's some really good insight into different ways to unstick commission progress. So I'll leave it at that. Next slide, please. So if your state doesn't have a future of gas docket, where else might these issues arise? And the answer is a lot of places, both at the commission. You can see here a list of other dockets that relate to future of gas issues, governor's offices and state agencies working on supportive, electrification and greenhouse gas reduction goals, and then at the legislature, a whole different beast, but there's a lot of future of gas issues that are really related to what we're talking about in these dockets. Next slide. The challenges, future of gas, this issue, as we're going to hear today, and we already know, are very complicated, far-reaching, and the decisions that we make in the dockets and at the legislature and other dockets at the commissions are really consequential. There's a shortage of commission and advocate and utility resources. There's a shortage of time, both to work on the dockets and to address these really big issues. There's always the question of commission authority and direction. And then there's also, the need to build a record, but also take decisive policy action, or at least set that up. So those are challenges to any investigatory docket that align state goals, but the future of gas is really no different. Next slide, please. So I'll end here by just saying that we've seen today that the future of gas is really more than just future of gas proceedings. They can be a really good venue for policy change, or at least a place to build a good record. As Kristen noted, there now exists a substantial record across the country that we can really build upon going forward. So if you're in a state with a future of gas docket, there are ways and examples now that can help push your commission forward. If you're not in a state with one, there are plenty of opportunities outside of a docket like that to be engaged in these issues. And I'll just end by saying that RMI facilitates a regulatory working group for advocates to work through a lot of these issues. We meet monthly. If you want to sign up and you're an advocate, please let me know. I'll put my email in the chat as well. That's all I had. Thanks for the time. I'm looking forward to the other presenters and the discussion.
Thank you so much, Joe. The people are asking when you're going to be a commissioner, so let us know if we're looking at 2030 or sooner. Yes, thank you so much. Okay, I'm excited now to pass the mic to Dory Seeley.
All right, thanks so much, Kristen. So Joe, thank you for a clear and important grounding on the future of gas proceedings. I think those proceedings are definitely impacting regulatory commissions across the country, and they're also increasing risk and uncertainty for the gas industry and its investors. So what I'm going to do is take us on a bullet train ride through what I think we've been learning about the changing economics of the gas distribution industry. It's an economics under disruption, as I will show. Over the past few years, as Kristen mentioned, a specialized research field has emerged focused on the costs of state and city gas systems. BDC and Groundwork Data released two such studies recently, one on New York, the other on Illinois. And I've compiled a list of all the studies I know about that you can find at the end of my slides. There's also important growing expert testimony that's occurring on these topics in rate cases and other proceedings. So I'm going to step back and ask the question, what is this research showing us about the economics of regulated gas distribution. And I have 6 meta-research findings to present, but first allow me 2 background points. Next slide. So researchers like me dig into the historical cost of gas capital spending. We look for trends in unit costs for main replacement and search for the data inputs needed to project future revenue requirements and customer bill impacts. Now, this can be fun sometimes, but why is this work needed? It's needed because these issues typically are not addressed in standard gas utility regulatory proceedings. I've listed for you here my top beefs regarding impediments that one encounters. I won't go through them, but suffice it to say that it's rare to find comprehensive reporting on past spending and outcomes. Be prepared to dig for this information, piece it together from multiple sources, and even file for right-to-know requests. Also, don't expect to find utility projections of future cumulative spending. Gas proceedings are notorious for being restricted in their purview to just a year or 2 ahead, at most 5 years out. So the future of gas field, the research field, has come about because traditional regulatory frameworks turn a blind eye to the future and to a large extent shield gas companies from energy transition risks. And that's why the future of gas investigations that Joe spoke about can help shake things up. Next slide. My second background point is to underscore and be very clear about the response of the gas distribution industry to the energy transition. First, the industry is proposing to modernize the existing gas system so that it can carry lower carbon gases such as renewable natural gas and hydrogen. In our recent Illinois report, we devote a whole chapter to this topic. The second part of the industry's response is slamming capital spending related to replacing aging pipeline. Nationally, this spending increased 3-fold over the last decade. In many states and cities, replacing gas mains has become the largest public interest project ever undertaken. These are multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects whose cumulative opportunity costs are rarely accounted for and made publicly transparent. About 40 states have put in place accelerated cost recovery regulatory mechanisms, and this massive spending leverages those. These riders and surcharges allow gas utilities to begin recouping their spending nearly immediately and outside of traditional rate cases. Utilities love them because they allow for faster and more predictable returns on investment compared to cost recovery via normal rate cases. Next slide. So can we say anything about what our gas system is costing us nationally? The slide here is divided into the past on the left-hand side and the future on the right. So the line graph for the past shows that during the last decade, the gas distribution industry spent a total of about $160 billion, tripling its investment and topping out at an annual investment level of $21 billion in 2022. This data is from the American Gas Association. Now, regarding the future, in my report, Leaked and Combusted, I presented a cost calculation based on that $21 billion spending figure. And what I found was that if that spending continues at a level rate through 2050, the gas industry would commit ratepayers to paying back fully loaded capital costs of $1.4 trillion. By fully loaded, I mean cost recovery of the direct capital spending, that's $21 billion a year times 27 years, plus the approved rate of return that utilities receive on the capital they invest. And next slide. So let me go now to my synthesis of some high-level research findings. And I'm counting on this to be a low-risk disclosure because to the extent that many or all of these points seem like no-brainers, then that just reinforces Kristen's compelling strategy of raising the bar. Next slide. So finding number one, this comes from a long view perspective on the economic history of industries. Industries typically exhibit a life cycle that consists of expansion, maturity, and then decline. And as we look around the country, there is a lot of evidence that the gas distribution industry has achieved market saturation and that gas demand has plateaued. We now see gas demand strictly declining in some states, for example, California, where it's falling at about 2% per year. And we also know gas demand is declining in Europe. Now, regulatory structures currently protect mature gas utilities from a lot of risk. And without that protection, these companies would arguably be behaving very differently in their mature phase. In particular, it's questionable that they would be spending billions of dollars on long-lived assets without the confidence that they are selling a product that customers will want for a long time. Next slide. I wanted to illustrate this conundrum with a figure from our work in Illinois. It shows the burst in capital spending over the last decade, that's the red line, at a time when the gas customer base in Illinois is level, it's the blue line. So this paradox is really key to understanding the building disruptive pressure on the economics of today's gas industry. Next slide. The next meta finding is that there are critical incentives embedded in gas utility regulation that drive a lot of the outcomes that we see, including the high levels of capital investment at a time of stagnant gas demand. So first, gas companies overinvest in replacement and underinvest in leak detection and repair. Now, why is that? It's because they're allowed to earn a rate of return on the former, but not on the latter, even though in general, it's more cost effective to abate leaks via leak detection and repair. The classic article on this is by the economists Hausman and Mullenbach in 2017. The overinvestment also likely indicates excess returns on equity, the idea that the regulated rate of return received by utilities exceeds their actual cost of capital. The second perverse incentive is that leak repair is further discouraged because gas utilities pass on the cost of lost gas to their customers. As a result, gas utilities locate and repair leaks at levels that are far below the value of the gas that they could save. Finally, the immense social costs of gas, climate, health, and environmental are ignored by gas utilities because these costs are external to their operations. If they had to take them into account, their decisions would be very different. More about that in a minute. Next slide. The third finding goes to the core of how gas distribution economics is working today. Aggressive pipeline replacement results in steep bill impacts for customers, plus record utility profits, independent of climate change. So the figure on the left captures the causal relationship between increasing CapEx on the one hand and rising customer rates on the other for a hypothetical company with real numbers. The second graph shows the further connection to rising utility operating income, which here is just a standard for earnings and profit. So when we modeled this example, the indicated annual capital spending of roughly $650 million a year led to yearly rate increases of 7% for customers, and it resulted in a 9% annual increase in operating income. So this gives you a sense of the sizable transfer from ratepayers to investors. It's a distributional effect. So this powerful dynamic is taking place in a number of states and cities, and it's happening regardless of climate policies and goals. So to summarize, the gas distribution industry is entrenched right now in a costly, prolonged infrastructure replacement phase that is driving the expansion of its rate base, which in turn is fueling steep customer rate increases and record earnings growth. Next slide. A fourth higher level finding is that the pending gas customer decline is really the great unknown. And we know that when it gains traction, it will have a transformative effect on the gas transition, and it will disrupt the core dynamic that I conveyed on the previous slide. So Morgan's going to take on this topic. So let me simply offer the graphic on this slide. It shows that with customer attrition, which is shown in the orange flows, costs must be spread over fewer gas sales, pushing rates up further. And that's shown in the black expanding area, thereby encouraging more customers to depart. So at some point, demand destruction, if you will, may set off ratchet effects and trigger the need for spiraling rate increases. In our work at Groundwork Data, we get a handle on this unknown by modeling customer decline at, say, a moderate or a high rate, and then examining the impacts of that on the needed rate increases. It's a kind of sensitivity analysis. For Illinois, for example, we found that a 2% rate of customer decline doubled average delivery costs, that means rates for customers, for each utility over just 10 years. Next slide. So the next finding concerns asset stranding, and the prospect of stranded assets is going to be a very serious problem, given that utilities are vigorously investing in long-lived assets without a credible plan for recovering these costs, given the energy transition. So independent studies do their best to quantify the magnitude of the potential unrecovered assets at different points in time. And the math isn't difficult. You know, if a pipe lasts 60 years, for every dollar spent today on that pipe, nearly 60 cents will still be unrecovered by 2050, assuming a straight line depreciation, which is what most utilities use. So applied to Illinois, as shown in the slide, we found that under a business as usual investment scenario, unrecovered assets would increase from $13 billion now to $42 billion in 2050. That's a huge problem to reckon with. Not the magnitude of the unrecovered assets, but the risk of incomplete cost recovery. That's tied to the prospect of the contracting customer base, which we talked about in the previous slide. So everybody has skin in the game on this issue. Of course, utilities and their investors, but also gas customers and taxpayers. They're at risk as well. So next slide. The last finding I would offer concerns social costs. So leaked and combusted methane impose outsized social costs, as we know, and gas companies are not accountable for the climate change, the climate damage, and the other harm caused by the leakage of their own product and their own infrastructure. So because the true costs of gas are hidden, installing a new gas pipeline or a peaker plant, you know, for a utility or for a consumer buying a new gas furnace, those appear less costly than they really are. In other words, investment and spending decisions get distorted. So the example I show here is from Boston, Massachusetts. It compares the total cost of gas and electricity in 2023, inclusive of their social costs. So the commodity cost of electricity was, and today still is, greater than that of gas. That's the teal bars. And electricity has a positive social cost, since half of New England's grid electricity comes from gas-fired power plants. But the social cost of gas is much higher than that of electricity, 70% higher. And you can see there the orange bars, which quantify the social cost of both leaked and combusted gas using US government EPA factors. So at the end of the day, electricity in the Boston, Massachusetts is 27% less expensive than gas if you take into account the social costs. So this kind of finding is really important for countering the gas industry narrative that the high cost of electricity makes electrification infeasible for gas customers. And it's also important as a leverage point for reforming rates to drive the adoption of heat pumps and EVs. Next slide. So where do we go from here? I have listed out key recommendations that we at Groundwork Data make, and I believe are supported by many other researchers in this field. So most urgently, we need to push regulators, legislators, and executive branch officials to halt further expansion of the gas distribution system, sunset accelerated cost recovery, limit capital spending on replacement, require screening of non-pipe alternatives, and finally get going on strategically downsizing the gas system. And there's also much important work that needs to be done to integrate planning and rate setting across the electric and gas sectors. So see the next slide for a list of some of the studies that I referred to. But Kristen, I'm going to sign off here and pass it off to Morgan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dory. I think you gave us the 101, the 201, the 301 on gas economics. So I feel schooled in the best way possible. Thank you for sharing all that information in such an accessible way. And you will be getting the slides with Dory's appendix, so don't worry about that. All right, I am excited to now pass the mic to Morgan.
All right, thank you, Kristen. I wanted to maybe begin by echoing some of the things that you said in your introductory remarks. It's really exciting to be part of this panel and also to see the number of folks who have signed on to learn more about the future of gas. So this is a topic where when I started studying it maybe a decade ago, people were like, why are you studying this topic? There's so many things you could be spending your time on. And people don't ask me that question anymore. So it really speaks to the kind of moment I think that we're in and thinking about the future of gas and the future of building decarbonization. So I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin. I also did my PhD at MIT, so you'll see some examples from what I talk about today, also from Massachusetts, but we do a lot of work on building decarbonization in the Midwest. So our lab broadly works on assessing and tracking the effects of climate actions across different policy scales. So we do international and national climate policy modeling, but we also do a lot of hyperlocal work. And often when we think about some of the thorny challenges that come up with questions around gas phase down, building decarbonization, it really requires that local perspective. So that's what I'll be talking about today. And on the next slide, I just show some of the members of my research group. The work that I'm going to be talking about today and all of the work that we do wouldn't be possible without them. And in particular, some of the studies I'm going to be discussing are the work of Jaime, Jake, and Jingling, as well as our collaborators at HEAT in Massachusetts and researchers at the University of Maryland. And so on the next slide, I just wanted to start by kind of talking about, this is probably old news to folks on this call, but some of the challenges that we're facing as we're thinking about our energy infrastructure. And two of the big ones are addressing the threat of climate change and addressing the problem of energy poverty. So we have a lot of households in the United States who are still highly energy burdened. And we want to make sure, as we're thinking about the future of our energy systems, that we're doing it in a way that also addresses the problems of energy poverty. But historically, our policy responses have been insufficient to address both of these twin challenges. And so on the next slide, I talk a little bit about some of these terms that we'll be returning to, energy poverty and energy justice. And so when I say a household is energy poor or energy insecure, it means that they're having trouble meeting their energy needs. And studies suggest that this is a really prevalent problem in the United States, with 27% of households reporting that they have difficulty paying their energy bills, or they've taken various behaviors, such as keeping their homes at unsafe temperatures, in order to be able to pay those bills. A subset of these households also experience electricity shutoffs. And so this is a big challenge. We also talk about one way of studying this challenge is the concept of energy burden. And this is looking at what percentage of folks' income they spend on their energy bills. And perhaps not surprisingly, for low-income households, that energy burden, the amount they're spending as a percentage of their income on those bills, is a lot higher than it is across the United States as a whole. And so in addition to low-income households being disproportionately affected, racial and ethnic minorities, as well as renter households, tend to be more energy burdened. And so when we think about energy justice, which is one of the fields that my research is in, this is really a call for everybody to have access to clean and safe and affordable energy, and also to be able to participate in the energy decisions that affect them. And so we'll be thinking about that and applying it in particular to the gas transition. And so on the next slide, I just show a map of energy burdens among low-income households in the United States. And the big takeaway here is that this is not a problem that's isolated to one particular region or one particular area. There's variation, but this is a big problem across the entire country. And on the next slide, one of the reasons that I think it's particularly important to be thinking about this challenge now is that on the national scale, a lot of our climate policy is being implemented in the form of incentives for folks to adopt new technologies. And particularly when we look at transportation and the building sector, a lot of the emissions reductions that we're expecting from things like the Inflation Reduction Act are coming from individuals taking up incentives and adopting new technologies. And so that means it's really important for us to consider and understand who is adopting these technologies and who might be left behind. And so on the next slide, when I think about questions around energy justice and building decarbonization, there's a few big things that I'm thinking about. And so I'm going to quickly talk about some of the research that we've been doing in an attempt to answer these questions. And I'm happy to unpack some of this more also during the Q&A. And so the first question that we've been thinking about is trying to understand how effective previous policies have been at reducing the climate impacts of home heating. And so on the next, you can skip 2 slides, Kristen. So this gives a picture of the gas leaks in one case study state of Massachusetts. So I know we're thinking a lot about the future of gas, but I also wanted to spend just a minute to highlight the present of gas as well. A lot of our gas systems, especially in like large cities around the East Coast, these pipelines are very old and they're very leak prone, which means we have a lot of gas leaking. Natural gas is primarily methane, it's a potent greenhouse gas. And some estimates in Massachusetts suggested it might be 10% of the state's emissions inventory is just made up of this leaked gas. And so on the next slide, one of the policy levers that we've looked at is the potential to repair these leaks. But it's important to note that these leak repairs are not always successful. So in the map, what I show is in the purple dots, these are situations where a repair is made, but then later a leak is either reported or repaired in the exact same location. And if you look at all the repairs that were made over a 5-year period of this study, we found that around 20% of those repairs were unsuccessful. And the bar chart here shows that those repairs are potentially even less successful among the leaks that are referred to as leaks of significant environmental impact. So these are the super emitters that are emitting a lot of methane into the atmosphere. And if you measure these leaks after the repairs occur, you can see as many of them are still leaks of significant environmental impact in the same location, even after those repairs occur. So what this really highlights to me, it's not that we shouldn't be repairing leaks, we absolutely should, but it shows us the challenges of kind of managing this really complicated and really unwieldy natural gas system. And these challenges could become even greater if we don't coordinate our decarbonization transition. And I think this also highlights the importance of collaboration and policy learning. So doing this kind of research wouldn't have been possible without nonprofits, activists, researchers, utilities. And so we really need all hands on deck to be able to understand what kinds of policy responses are effective and how we can design more effective responses going forward. And so on the next slide, given some of these challenges of addressing the climate impacts of the gas system, and I should say, even if gas leaks were 0, we would still need to think about alternatives to gas, because when you burn gas, you obviously release CO2, carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. But given these challenges, another important question to ask is, given that electrification is an important strategy for long-term decarbonization, who is electrified so far, and are these electrification rates equitable? And when we say equity, it's important to distinguish between a couple of different concepts. So we can think about an inequality as a case where there's a difference in technology adoption across different populations. But an inequity is a normative concept where we have a difference across populations that we consider to be unfair as a society. And then an injustice is a case where policies or other kinds of systemic factors either exacerbate these inequities or fail to address them. And so there's been a lot of research that has found inequities in adoption of other kinds of clean energy technologies. Most of this research has focused on rooftop solar. And this work has found racial and income disparities in who has access to rooftop solar. And that's even after you control for factors that you would expect to be related to the adoption of these technologies, like solar resource potential. And often, in fact, race and ethnicity are a stronger predictor of adoption than is income. So suggesting that this is not just an income challenge, but it's also a racial equity challenge. But when we think about inequities in electrification with heat pumps, it's important to also take into account the fact that the benefits of heat pumps, in terms of the effect they have on energy bills, can vary depending on location and other factors. And so when we ask about inequities in heat pump adoption, what we're really asking is, are marginalized communities less likely to have a heat pump in areas where they're beneficial? And so on the next slide, I show some results trying to answer this question. So this is research that's forthcoming in Joule. It combines a model of the net benefits of heat pumps on energy bills with a household property data set that looks at which homes currently have heat pumps installed. And what you can see here with the green bars on the left is that households that are racial and ethnic minorities are less likely to have heat pumps, even when those heat pumps would provide them with benefits. And this suggests that when we're thinking about our electrification transition, we need to be really careful, because the evidence so far is that we're not seeing electrification equitably across the country. So then the final question that I'll talk a little bit about is thinking about, and this returns to our question about the future of gas, and of what are the combined effects of these previous and also ongoing policies on energy poverty. And here I'm going to be kind of echoing and building on a lot of the groundbreaking work that Dory has done in this area. So just to kind of reiterate what she was also saying, a big concern when we think about phasing down the gas network is that as customers exit, our cost per customer can rise. And they can rise even more so when we think about the financial pressure that's placed on utilities from large pipeline replacement programs. And so what this plot shows is, for one example utility in Massachusetts, how we would expect cost per customer to increase. In the blue line is without any pipeline replacements, and the red line is in a case where the utility is replacing leak-prone infrastructure. And so what we see is here's a potential problem where the cost per customer are increasing significantly during our decarbonization transition. And this isn't a challenge that's just limited to Massachusetts. Dory talked about some of her work in other states, and in some of the national modeling that we've done, we've also found that among utilities that have leak-prone infrastructure, there are potentially similar kind of looming challenges that need to be addressed. But then on the next slide, we can think about, how do these costs per customer translate into energy burdens and energy equity questions? And so to do that, we take our results on cost per customer, and we also look at detailed demographic data on utility bills, in this case throughout Massachusetts, and some of our other work, we're expanding this and looking nationally. And so what you see in the gray bar is current energy burdens. And then in the colorful bars are energy burdens under different scenarios, depending on which households are prioritized for decarbonization. And so what we see is, if we follow a kind of historical case where wealthier households are more likely to be early adopters and electrify, energy burdens rise because our lower income households are disproportionately left behind and paying higher bills for natural gas heating. But if instead we have a policy where we electrify our low-income households first, then over the next approximately 15 years, we can keep energy burdens in this state roughly constant. But this kind of intermediate fix doesn't address the long-term challenges that Dory was talking about with natural gas phase out. So we're going to reach a situation where sufficient number of customers have left, the cost per customer are so high that without kind of thoughtful planning, we expect energy burdens to rise no matter who has been electrified first. And so this is where we need to think about more kind of systematic and coordinated strategies, things like neighborhood scale electrification and thermal networks that help reduce the per customer cost of the gas network. So I'll stop there. On the next slide, I have my email address if folks would like to email with more questions or check out the latest work that we're doing at the Climate Action Lab. And I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Morgan. I'm so excited for your full findings to come out. So please let us know when that's published. So now we have about 24 minutes for a robust question and answer session. I'm going to stop sharing the slides so we can all just, I guess, look at our faces here of the panelists. So feel free to add new questions to the chat. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off with some questions we've received. One that I think is particularly interesting is about how do we get, Joe, maybe this is for you, but like if our PUC, our state PUC is stuck ideologically or procedurally or something, both, are there any good resources or reports to get them unstuck that you can think of top of mind, or just what are some of your suggestions from your experience about how to unstick that process?
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. That's a great question. I believe Tiffany put the link to that series of reports from RMI that I mentioned. I think we'll probably put it into the chat again. That again is a great like big picture overview of how to unstick commissions in their attempt to align the regulatory framework with state policy goals. I think there's a few ways to think about it from the gas system and the future of gas perspective. One is to lay out different tracks of shorter term things that we can address today or very soon, and things that we need to really talk about. I mentioned the Office of People's Counsel petition in Maryland. If you read the petition, it's a really good deep dive into talking about the problem and then thinking about different near and like longer term ways to address future of gas issues. So I think that was like a really comprehensive and elegant way to do it. Part of it, gets to building on what other states have done. Now that we have kind of like a body of knowledge that's been developed, and to help communicate that with regulators and stakeholders and utilities, so that we're all kind of starting from a similar point. And then I think one of the things that we've seen across commissions, both in future of gas and in other contexts, is there's often a commissioner, or maybe two commissioners, but someone who is really driving the issue forward, even if the commission itself is all interested in it. I know that that's happened in several states that we've been looking at. It can sometimes just be as simple as one person and staff are really pushing things forward. So that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires a lot of kind of like building that knowledge base and identifying commission partners and stuff like that. But there's multiple ways to get unstuck, but they're all I think can be complementary and just really dependent on the state.
Thanks for that, Joe. And Dory, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, Joe, I wanted to add one way I see commissions or these proceedings getting stuck. It's more like they go around in a circle, and I don't have a solution for it, but it's about data. So you'll have gas companies, for example, testify or make presentations where they say, heat pumps don't work in cold climates, or there's not enough grid capacity to move 1 million customers off of gas and onto heat pumps. And there are not necessarily always the answers to this, but there's a lot of information and data. And so then and then you'll have the the environmental advocates say the opposite. And so how do you make progress when there's no agreement on basic engineering data, or grid capacity data? So I think it's a problem that can be anticipated, and a commission in advance has to have some rules and protocols around that. Of course, one solution is to have a pathway study, but in Massachusetts, what happened was a lot of us questioned the assumptions of the pathway study, but at least there was one set of numbers to argue about. So anyway, this problem of data and information is super important, and one that can be anticipated.
Yeah. Speaking of data, I'd love to hear, from Morgan and Dory and Joe as well, but like Dory gave us her beefs about like what's standing in the way of her and her data. But I'm curious if you could share some of like the workarounds or methodologies or kind of how you MacGyvered your way into some of this data that wasn't available, or just anything more you could say about that process. So Morgan, you have your hand up, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to start by just building on what others have said, that I think one important source of data is pilot projects. And we're increasingly getting more of that on the ground data. So a lot of the work that I do is modeling work. So we're using data to prospectively try to understand what might happen if certain kinds of decisions were made in the future. But increasingly, like those decisions are actually being made, and we're able to look at pilots of different approaches to phasing down the natural gas network. We're looking at examples where heat pumps are adopted in cold climates. So we have real data where we can say, this is how they were operated in real homes, and these are the effects that they had on energy bills. And I think that kind of real on the ground data helps often break through these kinds of disagreements where you might have different folks with different modeling assumptions coming to different conclusions. And your second question was about kind of how you deal with that, the pre-pilot project. And one thing, and Dory brought this up too, but is the importance of sensitivity analysis. So really trying to understand what are the core assumptions that your results depend on. And sometimes certain aspects, especially when you think about the big picture conclusions that are important for policy, might be less sensitive to some of the data inputs that you think. And so that is certainly true when we think about these kind of feedback loops in the phase down of the gas network, that the exact percentages change a little bit, but across different kinds of assumptions about exactly how much pipeline replacement occurs, or exactly what the how the costs are broken down across different categories, you get really robust conclusions that I think are ready to be shared with the policy community and the regulatory community.
Yeah, Joe?
Yeah, so I think there's two pieces of data knowledge that I want to share. First is that there's a lot of existing data buried in kind of like forgotten reports that they're almost like zombie reports that utilities file, and sometimes like nothing, at least in Minnesota, nothing even happens because they're requirements from kind of like old legacy proceedings. So I think you included some work that I helped with at Fresh Energy on kind of like Minnesota's gas system. So Caitlin Eichten and Kurt Nordgaard were really instrumental at Fresh Energy in helping to pull that together. And it was all based on both state PUC docket reportings or filings, reporting to EIA and other federal agencies. And one way that I've seen things like that kind of jump into the future of gas dockets is so switching over to Maryland, during the PSC's hearing in July, where they talked about opening the docket itself. Maryland has a pathways study that looks at some of the pathways that we've talked about here to decarbonize, but utilities also file kind of like expectations about gas use for like gas procurement. And there's a disconnect there between like what a pathway study will show for in terms of use going forward, and what the utilities like actually planning for. And the commission was like, there's a difference here. Help us understand this. So I think those two reports are distinct and intended for different purposes, but I think highlighting those differences and requiring utilities to build in we talked about sensitivity analyses or other scenarios into some of those existing processes are ways that we can really build on and align kind of what they're saying in one docket versus what they're saying or what could happen in another docket. And that gets into like gas planning and other things like that. But there's a lot of existing data out there, but it's just kind of hard work to find it all and put it together.
Yeah, beware the paper cuts of the zombie reports. But yeah, that work of bringing things together, I mean, that's what makes those shifts possible, of kind of like the data is out there, we know what we need to know a lot of the times, but it's about kind of bringing it together. Morgan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I'll say I think a lot of the groups represented in this panel and also that I'm seeing represented in the chat are the kind of groups who are already doing some of this convening work of collating and publishing this paper, or this data. But I think it's also an opportunity for us as a community to think about what are the kinds of data that we would like to have, and are there ways that we can be crowdsourcing that and collaborating on that data collection so that we don't have different groups repeating what can be a really big effort to collect similar kinds of data, and how can we make it available to everyone?
Yeah, and like what's portable across proceedings? It's like, does every regulatory commission need to start at zero? Like what is a given that we can kind of import from other states? Yeah, Dory, did you want to add anything on that topic? Okay. Well, I have some questions about kind of the solution side. So one is thinking about what the viable pathways forward are for gas-only utilities versus dual fuel, as it's kind of an existential crisis, right? If we're talking about not using gas. And I know on the BDC side, a lot of what we've seen being explored on the policy front is trying to allow gas utilities to evolve into thermal utilities. So focusing on them delivering heat instead of gas through especially thermal energy networks. So New York passed a law, UTENJA, Utilities, Thermal Energy Networks and Jobs Act. Washington just passed a law this year that is going to allow gas utilities to operate their own thermal energy networks. So there's been a lot of progress on this front, both on the technology side as well as the policy side, that can allow a pathway forward for gas utilities and their workers. I'm curious if our other panelists have other thoughts about what the pathway forward is for gas-only utilities.
I'll take a whack at it, Kristen. Gas-only utilities are in a really, really, really difficult place. Especially if they have a rate base that has a lot of unrecovered assets in it, and they're in the middle of a serious replacement cycle. I agree with you, Kristen, that exploring thermal energy networks is a really interesting possibility for a gas-only utility. So, you know, if you look at People's Gas in Chicago at the base of Lake Michigan, it's next to this huge thermal reservoir of cold water, you know, and heat gives off heat. So that's something to think about. I think the other thing I would do is if I was in charge of one, would make really good friends with the next door electric utility and try and collaborate with the city that you're in and see if that kind of open conversation can come up with some ideas. I mean, an electric utility, I suppose, conceivably could buy the gas utility, and then you could combine the rate base. I think the solutions are more obvious for dual fuel utilities. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Yeah, Joe?
Yeah, that was a great response, and I don't have the grand answer, but you know, plus wanting the I think emergence of different business models. So looking at thermal energy utilities, I feel like we've been having a similar discussion on the electric side about you know, depending on whether you're vertically integrated or a wires only utility, like how to think about providing energy services or platform model. I feel like we're having kind of a similar discussion about, you know, providing heat as a service. You know, targeted electrification and NPAs, I think, are two regulatory tools you can use to like start testing those, and utilities and commissions are starting to do that across the country. Um, I think too, over the history of gas utilities, they've gone from, street lighting companies to like a town gas utility to now kind of a distribution utility. So, the evolution in the business model has happened, for economic and policy reasons already. And so we're, in another evolutionary phase. And so I think we'll continue to hopefully work on incentives and policies that will help utilities evolve in the public interest. But I also agree with Dory that I think we may be seeing more consolidation in terms of the corporate entities, but there has to be a reason to merge. For an electric only or a combo utility to want to buy a gas utility, they have to be desirable. So we're going to start to work through that. That to me gets into the bucket of medium to long term kind of like tricky things to think about. How the Public Utilities Commissions and advocates can think about that, but it's there's going to be will have to be a reason that's compelling to executives.
Yeah, thanks for that, Morgan.
I'll also echo what everyone's been saying, that the solutions are going to be very location specific. So it's not going to be the same for every utility, and it's not going to be the same for every gas system. And so I think we need to be thinking about, as we're seeing these examples playing out, what are some of the common themes that we see across different cases that we can use as sort of rules of thumb when thinking about what these transitions might look like. And in particular, not just what the endpoint looks like, but what all the points along the way and all those intermediate milestones look like. Especially thinking for like how we pare down this network and in what order that we do it. So I think some of that's going to be things that we'll learn from other cases, but some of it just means we need a lot more folks working on this problem and doing that kind of detailed modeling and community engagement work to answer those questions.
Yeah, and great segue to this next question, which is about how do we encourage broader community participation by taking some of these somewhat heady and research specific talking points and transforming them for a general audience to make these concepts and arguments accessible. And just one plug about the comm side of things is that Sunstone Strategies is doing research right now about, they're doing polling and figuring out like what are the talking points that work for a general audience, how can we speak to them about why we need to transition off the gas system. But I'm curious if any of you have had experience with kind of transforming some of your talking points into more accessible language for a general audience, what you would say in the neighborhood about why we need to pay attention to this gas system transition. Yeah, Joe.
I can kick it off. So two more examples. One to follow on this Hunstone plug, the November regulatory working group, whichever the third. It's not Thanksgiving, but the third Thursday in November, we're going to have a Sunstone join us to kind of work through how do you think about regulatory proceedings when you're thinking about communicating that to the public and using that polling data and their developed best practices to try to do that translation. I'll also plug something from Minnesota that I was a part of at Fresh Energy that's still really going strong, and that's the Clean Heat Minnesota Coalition. I know there's several folks here on the call who are involved in that. So that's evolved from like a Fresh Energy, Cub Minnesota, which is the consumer advocate, and Copal, which is the community-based organization. Really working on existing in the PUC space, but also existing and interacting and organizing within communities. So they have, I think, a really good start on how to communicate these issues in a way that will land in communities and I think respects like the tug of war of time and resources that we're all facing. So how do you do that in a way that's really helpful and productive?
Yeah, Morgan.
I'll add perhaps a related point. So in addition to thinking about what those talking points are. And one I'll highlight is particularly when we're thinking about challenges of energy poverty, like climate change can feel like a distant problem compared to the problem of not being able to pay your energy bill. And so for different audiences, different kinds of narratives are most effective, but I think really focusing on cases where electrification is beneficial, it's going to lower your energy bills. Like those are the things that we need to be thinking a lot about. And there's also a lot of research that talks about the importance of what are called seeding effects. So the idea that if your neighbor has adopted a new technology, you're going to be more likely to adopt that technology too. So I think this speaks to another important aspect of piloting, going in and starting to install things and build this infrastructure, is that we're not always the only messenger. Often it's somebody who's closest to home.
Yeah, and I think that point about not being the only messenger, we can also see that there's a big possibility for like community ownership over things like thermal energy networks, like really putting the neighborhood in neighborhood scale. And I also think there's something like inherently communal about like the way, like it's like poetic how like heat pumps and thermal energy networks work, is that they're like taking what's there and redistributing it, like rather than creating more like and burning off excess. So that's my sort of poetic take on just like there's a kind of beautiful simplicity in the shared nature of how these energy systems work. Dory.
Yeah, well, I saw the question in the chat around making more of this information, making it more accessible, which I really appreciate. And this is sort of a light and fun, but yet serious suggestion, which is everybody should subscribe to the feed of Hot and Toxic, which is a creative storytelling group that puts up these posts. They're like videos and performances, but it's about the dangers of gas, and it's about fossil fuel disinformation. And it's meant for people younger than myself, but I find it just fantastic and refreshing, but serious.
Yeah, we'll put that link in the notes. We're just about out of time here, but there's one very important question we haven't gotten to that came at the top of the webinar, which is which PUC PSC has the best logo in your opinion? Joe, maybe this is maybe you have one as a tattoo, I don't know, or would get one.
Not yet. I don't know. The Washington UTC one was pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a shield or something. And then there's some really formal like state seal looking ones. So I'd encourage if you're on a commission or staff or know someone to we need to redo a revamp of a lot of these logos.
This will be our next party game, matching the logos and gas preceding names. So I'm sure we could just continue talking for another half hour at least, but I know everyone has busy days ahead of them. So what we'll do with the questions that we didn't answer is I'll do my best to wrangle our panelists to maybe answer some of those offline. We're going to put these all into a wonderful organized note document. Tiffany Vu, our amazing research associate, will do that. And then probably by midweek next week, we'll have all the materials buttoned up and we'll be sending them to your emails. If you can't wait until then, let me know and I'll try and give you a sneak peek at the slides. But thank you so much. Huge round of applause, even though I can't see any of your faces in the audience, but please give an air clap to our wonderful panelists, and thank you so much for helping build the consensus of what the future of gas should be. Thanks, y'all.